JD here, and as you can see, we are back on F122. Couple of these races here are ones I did recently. Haven't done any open lobbies for quite a while now. Been taking a bit of a break from the game. So with this footage, you can see quite rusty. Trying to get back into the swing of things before the release of F123. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about during this video, because there has been an ongoing F123 beta that I've spoken to many people involved, getting their thoughts and feelings. But also, we are going to experience the first teaser trailer of the new game today. And I believe by the time this video, or by the time you're watching this video, that has already been uploaded. So please let me know what your thoughts are of the teaser. Did it really satisfy you? Because I know from the previous game and really the previous couple of games, sometimes there's been a little bit left to be desired when it comes to these teasers. And I think a lot of people do argue that sometimes a lot of the budget goes into really the marketing of the game, trying to make it look as good as possible rather than the actual product itself, which in a way I do understand, because they need to make the sales, they need to actually sell the game, and people can't really get refunds whilst they have already purchased the game. So that's obviously a big part of it. But today we're actually going to be talking about how F123 actually feels, both from my own personal experience, but also with the input of many other drivers. And obviously the bigger data you have and the bigger sample size you have, the more of an accurate consensus you can get of where the game is currently at right now. But if we just start off with things that I kind of experienced in F122 and I would definitely like to be different for F123, I think the first thing was really the traction on this game and really just the stability. I've always found it to be quite inconsistent ever since the major handling update we had towards the start. I think it was probably in September, October time. The initial handling of this game, 22, was quite satisfying to play, but I think with that change, it kind of took a little bit of a step backwards, and particularly the traction has been very inconsistent. It's always been very difficult to recover the car and change the car. And I've said it many times before, I feel even if the handling is not realistic, just having the ability to have good racing, having a good balance between many of the elements which allow drivers to use their skill to outperform other drivers, that usually does make up for it. But yeah, the traction in F122, in my opinion, was very inconsistent. And just the balancing of the ERS and the DRS and the slipstream, I felt like with that balancing of the overtake button just being too powerful, the slipstream and DRS not being powerful enough, you kind of started to have these DRS trains where you just couldn't overtake. And we did see that in esports, but we also see it in online lobbies such as this, where no matter what kind of downforce level you're running, the overtake button is just so powerful and the slipstream is just not powerful and the DRS just isn't really powerful enough. It makes it really difficult to overtake. And like, unless you can see here where the guy is not actually using the overtake, but as soon as he does start using it, the pace kind of really levels out between the drivers, and it just makes it very difficult to make progress through the field, which is why we've seen the likes of Jan Watmir, I'd say, struggle a bit more in esports this year. It's qualifying. If you don't have a good qualifying, then it's going to be very difficult to make up positions. So I think the balancing of the ERS and the DRS definitely needs to be tweaked quite significantly for the F123 game. Another thing was really the tyre modelling, because again, if we go into competitive leagues and esports, and again, just even general online lobbies, really you want to be starting, if it's a 50% race, you really want to be starting on the hard tyre, purely because the warm-up on the hard tyre is just so poor. If you started on the mediums and you pit early, going onto the hards, people who already start on the hards, they're going to have a 1 to 2 second overcut, and then they're going to pit for a much faster, softer compound for the remainder of the race. So unless you started on pole position or on the front row and you had the pace to break the DRS and were really confident in your race pace, that's the only scenario where a medium to hard could work. But typically, most of the time, we saw almost every driver, every competitive driver in really any semi-competitive league, it's going to be a hard to medium strategy unless a safety car comes into play and it changes dynamics. So it didn't really leave much room for many strategic options on the F1 22 game, like we had on the previous games, where a medium to soft or soft to medium, the difference in degradation was quite substantial and the difference in pace was quite substantial. So it really did kind of favour drivers who were able to really turn on the harder compound tyres, like with Jarno Opmeer again on the games such as F1 2021, F1 2020. A lot of drivers couldn't make a harder compound work at the start of the game, and overtaking there was a lot more opportunities to do it because of the overtake button and how powerful it was. So I really hope we do return to somewhat of that kind of balance for the F1 23 game. And another thing was the setups. The setup options just haven't really changed for many years now. And I know there's only a certain number of components of the car, but I think just having a bit more of a variance between the setups rather than just having suspension geometry, suspension, I think hopefully they can include a lot more details within the setup, make it a bit more complicated to really add the variance to the setups. And the only change we had on last year's game was the aero went from 1 to 11 to 1 to 50. No other aspects of the setups have really changed in many years now. And again, I think the main issue with F1 22 was just really the kind of the racing itself, apart from the bugs and glitches, which unfortunately a lot of games will have. The racing just was not that exciting. But I think one of the other main things as well is actually the contact model, which is something I don't think really gets discussed too much. I do feel on the F1 22 game it was a bit sensitive and not very rewarding. Obviously, in an ideal world, you don't want to have the contact, but quite often cars would be getting stuck in other cars, and sometimes the smallest amounts of contact would be sending you into a little bit of a merry-go-round. So it just made it very difficult to actually race, have the wheel-to-wheel action on this game. And like I said, if you have that ability to have wheel-to-wheel action, the ability to move through the field. So if you're actually faster, if you had a poor qualifying, but you're much better in the race, or you're better at looking after your tyres, you should be rewarded for that much more and have the option to move your way through the field, rather than basically it doesn't matter how much faster you are than some other drivers, you really just can't make any progress, and kind of leaves the racing a little bit lackluster, to be desired, as the so to speak. But speaking of F1 23, having played this beta myself and also speaking to many other drivers just to get their thoughts and opinions, I can say that the traction is very different from the F1 22 game. So different that it feels like you're pretty much running medium traction on F1 22. That's kind of the best way to describe it. And this is a way that many F1 drivers have also described, that the realistic traction really does feel a lot more closer to medium traction than it does with no traction on the F1 games. And hopefully that's going to make the racing a little bit better. I think another thing to mention is that it's a lot easier to catch the car now and actually recover over steer moments and slides, quite similar to the Zhou moment in Monaco. This is something you really couldn't do in F1 22, where you pretty much, when you lost the car, it was going to be a pretty enormous effort to recover it. So that aspect of things, and like you just saw right here now, having that ability to actually catch the car, push the limits of the traction a lot more, and it just feels a lot more consistent as well, which I think is probably the main gripe I had. So in my opinion right now, the direction of the traction is definitely a lot better than it was on F1 22. Another thing is the use of the high gears not being as OP anymore. And I know you saw a lot of esport drivers and competitive drivers. For me personally, although the handling doesn't have to be realistic, it just felt very unnatural for me to be using the higher gears. You've seen people short shift into fifth gear through a corner that's less than 100 miles an hour. It just doesn't feel natural whatsoever when you're playing other racing games. So yeah, that having that ability kind of taken away, not to say it still can't be used, because I believe it still can be, it still feels like it can, but it doesn't really give you any more benefit than if you were to use a lower gear. So the kind of the benefit and the performance is the same. So you have a little bit more options of what gears to choose. And if you're someone who prefers to use a lower gear, much more towards the realistic gear you would be using in real life, then I really hope it stays the way where you don't have to rely on super high gears in order to get the stability and traction performance. In terms of the braking, this is something I feel has changed quite a bit, where you actually feel a lot more of the weight of the car under braking. So I think the last game where I really felt this was actually F1 2012, believe it or not. That's how long ago it actually felt that way. F1 2012, F1 2013, where in between a qualifying and a race, you could really notice the difference of the feeling of the car under braking. Whereas I really think for games such as 2014 all the way up to 2022, you don't really feel the fuel load, you don't really feel the difference in weight of the car. It feels, the braking points feel pretty much almost exactly the same as a qualifying and in the race itself. Whereas now, you feel like the car's a little bit more of a handful under the braking. You do have to be a little bit more delicate, braking a little bit earlier, harder to rotate the car. Feels like there's a lot more understeer involved. So you really do feel a little bit more connected to the car, which is definitely a big plus for me. Another thing is the ERS is reported to be easier than F1 22. For me, it feels quite similar at the moment in terms of the reharvesting. However, a big thing to note is the DRS is a lot more powerful, which is something I think we definitely needed on the previous game. So now, instead of track position really on F1 22, you'd really want to be the car ahead. If you had the similar amount of ERS, the overtake button was just so powerful, then even if the car behind had the DRS, it wouldn't really be so much of a benefit. But now with the DRS being a lot more powerful, although there's still a lot of testing to go, it should be much more beneficial to be the car behind, and hopefully you will be saving a lot more of the battery as well, because on videos such as when we did with Jan Watmir and Thomas Ronhaar at Spain, Thomas Ronhaar was pretty much saving almost the same amount of ERS compared to Jan Watmir, where I really think that shouldn't be the case. So hopefully it will actually be a lot more beneficial to be the car behind. So there's going to be a lot more strategy, a lot more tactics involved, rather than just the qualifying, having the track position, and then you just being able to stay ahead. Hopefully there are more strategic games that drivers can actually be playing. And yeah, the DRS is definitely a lot more powerful. In terms of the tyre model, I feel like this is still somewhat similar. The degradation does feel a little bit different, so soft tyres could potentially be used a little bit more. I still don't think it's really an option in 50% races, but it feels like still the hard to medium will be the strategy. So that's something I really hope that they do address, they do tweak, just make it so there's a lot more options, as potentially instead of doing a one stop for many of these 50% races, a two or potentially even a three stop. Like, it'd be great if we could move to two stop races or something as well, even if it might not be completely realistic. I think just having a lot more strategic elements is just going to make the game a lot more exciting. In terms of setups, there only really has been one significant change. Don't know if this will actually make it into the game, but the suspension setting, where you had the suspension, the roll bar, and the ride height, instead of 1 to 11, the option is now 1 to 50. And again, we don't know if this will be actually there on the launch, but it kind of follows the same suit as the aerodynamics for F1 22. So there's going to be a lot more options to choose within the suspension. And I would say this is part of the setup where arguably is probably one of the most important for the car in terms of how the grip is distributed. It's probably the most important part other than the aerodynamics. So yeah, this is going to make it a lot more options for drivers. There's going to be a lot more variants and a lot more combinations to use, and a lot more opportunities for drivers to really find the sweet spot, because there have been many occasions where just making one click of a change really does upset the balance and the flow of the car. So now being able to make it a bit more of these micro adjustments can probably make a really big impact for many drivers. But really, that is all to tell from the F1 23 handling right now. Obviously can't show any footage, otherwise the video will probably be banned. But yeah, please let me know what your thoughts are of the teaser trailer. We might do a video reacting to that myself, but again, I think for many years now, the marketing of the game has been a big priority for Codemasters and EA. Hopefully we will have a release date today, if not very soon. But I'm really hoping that they will show a lot more features of this game as we get closer to the release date, which is expected to potentially be in June, so a little bit earlier than we have in the last couple of years. Please let me know your thoughts of the game, especially if you have experienced the beta as well. Let me know if you agree with any of these, and I'll be catching you very, very soon. Peace.